you said that dementia is not a disease of old age.
That's right.
It's so important for people to get that because, I've spent a lot of time with Professor Dale Bredesen in California. I'm sure you've seen some of Dale's work and some of his research. And, he's said on many occasions that, Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia may be starting even 30 years before it shows up. Now, you may or may not agree with that, but he's sort of said that the idea being that when you get symptoms is not when this starts. This starts
That's
a
right.
long way before. And therefore, there's an opportunity, if we're aware of that, to start taking preemptive and preventive action, in our 30s, in our 40s, in our 50s,
Right.
not when we're suddenly getting the diagnosis at the age of 72, let's say. So I want to just hammer home that the things in your book that are based absolutely in science in terms of what people can do, they're kind of relevant to everyone, particularly women, I would say no matter what your age, right?
I agree with you. I completely agree on everything you said. Alzheimer's disease is not like you just all of a sudden catch a cold. Right? It's not like tomorrow you go to the doctor and boom, you have Alzheimer's disease. There's something that's been happening in your brain for a really, really long time that eventually leads to the symptoms, which again speaks to how resilient the brain is, how strong these brains we have are, because they can literally fend off a whole amount of pathology and insults and problems for years and years and years. And your ability and your brain's cognitive reserve, right, against these insults is really largely based on the way you live your life. There is a genetic component. Our DNA is part of whoever we are, everything we are. It's involved in every bodily and neurological function. However, your medical report card and your lifestyle matter just as much for the vast majority of people. Like even in patients with genetically determined Alzheimer's, even for those very rare patients who carry genetic mutations that cause Alzheimer's at a young age, there's evidence that things like exercise can really delay the onset of dementia. And for the vast majority of the population, over 98% of people do not carry those genetic mutations. So risk is really more about the interplay of factors like, sure, there are genetic risk factors, your genes are important, but your lifestyle is just as important, your environment is just as important, your medical health is just as important. And those are the things that we need to take care of pretty much as soon as we're aware that they're important. It's not like you're 50 and today you have to take care of your brain. No, this brain health should really be part of overall health. We should really start thinking about our brains as our best friends and the part of us that needs nurturing and supporting, that is doing so much for us, right? So I think it's really important that we make choices that really support the brain. And I usually like to say that I encourage everyone to think of their brains more like a muscle. Right. There are things that you can do to make your brain stronger. You can exercise it properly. You can feed it properly. You can take care of it properly. And your brain will perform so much better for you at any age, really at any age.
Yeah. I mean, I want to sort of get into this lifestyle piece because there's so much that people can do, particularly the bit on movement as well, where less might be more for women, which I found really interesting and something I've been thinking about for some time as well. Before we do that, I wonder if we could deal with hormones and in particular HRT, which is obviously a very hot topic. It's a very divisive topic.
Very.
From you as a neuroscientist looking through the lens of the brain and with all the work you've done, what are your views on hormones and how they can be used to help brain health?
My views are that hormones are important and that the field has not developed the way that one would hope, especially as far as our brains are concerned. And I could talk about this for days to just give you the full detailed picture, but I think the bottom line is that preventing Alzheimer's or minimizing the depression and anxiety is not the same as treating hot flashes, right? So we know that hormonal replacement therapy is very effective at reducing, minimizing, and in some cases completely eliminating hot flashes for women who can tolerate the medication. Some women are not eligible for hormonal therapy for menopause, but most women are. And that is something that has been shown to be successful for. Like HRT can really help with hot flashes, with osteoporosis, with vaginal dryness, especially for women who undergo a hysterectomy or oophorectomy, which is the surgical removal of the uterus and or the ovaries. Now, when it comes to brain health, things become really complicated because the research is just not there. There have been clinical trials that looked at whether or not hormonal therapy could prevent dementia, right? And they showed that it cannot in women older than 65. So they were looking at women who were like 15 years post-menopause, and they were given hormones at that point, which is too late. It's just too late to start. Now, more recently, 2 very large clinical trials tested the efficacy of hormonal therapy in women who were a little bit younger, so within 5 years of menopause, and they showed no adverse effects, but also no benefit for cognition. And I would argue that that is, again, too late. We were talking about the lock in the key in the lock, the analogy. And the timeline is very important, because what happens in physiology is that this system where the hormone locks to the receptor is really age dependent. What happens to the receptors is that if you don't have hormones blocking for a really long time, the receptor shuts down. It just closes. The lock is no longer a lock. It just turns into a piece of door. So if you try to give the hormones then, nothing is ever going to happen, right?
Yeah.
You need to have plasticity. You need to have the hormones and the receptors. If the receptors said, okay, sorry guys, too late, there's no point giving hormones. So what we're trying to do right now is to better clarify this window of opportunity for brain health. And the way that we need to do it is not just by theoretically putting women in a clinical trial, but we need to look at their brains. We need to probe the system. Are these receptors working or not? Are they active or not? Does it make sense to give you hormones at this stage in your life as a woman?
Yeah.
So I think this is missing, and it's hard for me to answer the question without the right information. Right now, the question is, we don't know. Maybe for some women, especially women, again, who do receive hysterectomies and oophorectomies prior to menopause, the current recommendation is to take hormones. Yeah. Because that's been associated with a lower risk of Alzheimer's disease, a lower risk of osteoporosis, of hot flash, a lot of symptoms. For other women, the answer is that we don't quite know yet.
So a couple of things there. So again, I don't want to quote Professor Bredesen because he's not here, and so I want to make sure I'm accurately describing some of his work. But Dale very much takes a multi-pronged approach when he's trying to help a patient. So he is saying, he would try and change 7, 8, 9 different factors together, rather than typically it's, we'll try this one thing. Does it work? No, that's shown. Doesn't work. We'll try something else. And again, there's pros and cons of things, but I quite like that method in terms of it's not about trying to put everything onto one thing. It's doing multiple things. And I think he was the first person who really tuned me into thinking, maybe 6 years ago or so, that, maybe women should be, well, not women should be, maybe some women would benefit from taking estrogen in some form through and after the menopause, not to withdraw that sort of trophic support to the brain. And I found that really interesting because, as a husband, I was thinking, when my wife gets to that stage,
it's gonna be rough.
No,
I know what you were worried about.
Genuinely, it was more, once you know that, you can't unknow it, right? So then it's like, well, should women be routinely taking that or should we be considering that with respect to brain health?
Right.
And then, where I get conflicted in my head is that, we've looked through the evolutionary lens before about what men and women used to do when our brains were evolving. So I don't know if you're familiar with any work on this. I'm not. If you go to something like the Hadza tribe in Tanzania, for example, hunter-gatherer tribe who are still living their traditional lifestyles, right? In terms of their hunting, their gathering, they're very much living these low stress lives that are out in harmony with nature. I wonder, do they have a word for the menopause? Do they suffer menopausal symptoms in the same way?
Right.
Is it, I don't know. I wonder if you've come across that at all, because I think that would be really interesting.
It is really interesting. And we do know that the experience of menopause really changes a lot depending on different cultures. Like in Asia, women do not report nearly as much discomfort as women in the United States of America. So I think, yes, there's a genetic component, but I think the lifestyle.
Stress must be big, right?
Stress is huge. Yes.
I want to dive into this, but this is probably a good time to get into stress.
Yeah.
I can say this is not a scientific trial, but in my clinical experience, a lot of my female patients who come in with significant menopausal symptoms also have high degrees of stress in their life. Now, of course,
makes sense to me.
It could be that symptoms are getting bad and are not getting treated, which causes a stress. I absolutely recognize that.
Yeah.
But when I've really tried to unpick lifestyles for a number of years before it, stress seems to play a really big role. And I think, as you've explained in the book with the pregnenolone steal, there is a way that stress literally impacts and changes this kind of symphony of hormones in your body. So I wonder if you could expand a bit on stress and what that does to the brain.
Sure. So stress can literally steal your hormones. And that's because cortisol, which is the main stress hormone, is in balance with your estrogens. Because the body uses the same molecule, pregnenolone, which you mentioned before, to make cortisol and the sex hormones. So if you're super stressed out, like chronically stressed, your body will necessarily have to shift production of cortisol by taking the pregnenolone away from your sex hormones. And then you're going through menopause, or perimenopause, you're stressed out because you're a middle-aged woman with most likely a job, a family, elderly parents, you have no time for yourself, you're having hot flashes, or you're not feeling well because of hormonal changes. And then you also have the stress in your life and your hormones are going down further. So it really kind of turns into a vicious circle, right? Where the more stressed you are, the more symptoms you get. And who knows how we can stop it. But I think sometimes hormonal therapy might be a gateway to break the cycle. Sometimes it's more about lifestyle. There are things that we all can and should do to keep stress at bay. And that is so important, not just for hormones, but also really for brain health, because something we don't talk about enough, I think, as a society, is that too much stress is not only bad for your heart, it's also literally bad news for your brain. And there's this incredible study came out last year with hundreds, probably thousands of people who got brain scans, and they were middle-aged, like 40 to 65. And what they showed is that if you have high cortisol levels, that really correlates with brain shrinkage already in midlife and with a worsening in memory performance. So high stress can really negatively impact your ability to recall information already when you're 50 years old. And what I thought was particularly scary is that the brain shrinkage, when they actually looked at gender, they found out that the brain shrinkage was only found in women who were post-menopause. Which is, again, the gender bias. They didn't look at gender as a predictor. They were trying to remove the effects of gender, but then they realized that there was something really hard to get rid of. Yeah. And it turns out that it was the fact that only women and not men, only highly stressed women show brain shrinkage.
I mean, this is massively, you're basically saying that stress affects the brains of women differently than the brains of men.
That's right. It looks like men's brains are more resilient to stress, at least in midlife. And again, these studies are all the average, right? We're comparing the average man to the average woman. It tells you nothing about outliers and women who can tolerate stress beautifully and men who really suffer. But on average, women's brains tend to shrink in midlife when your stress levels are really high.
And when you say midlife, are you specifically talking about, what was that, sorry?
40 to 65.
40 to 65. So yeah, coming into that age of the perimenopause, I guess, and beyond.
Yeah.
I guess that really begs the question for me. And I have, men and women of all ages listening and watching this show. But if that really is the case, then in some ways that turning point to 40 is quite a significant one, in the sense of, look, of course it's going to be different in different people. And of course, these are just generalities, and it's, we can't say it's the same for everyone.
Right.
But it's almost like saying, hey, look, between your 20s and 40s, while you're building up life, figuring out who you are, what you want to be, tolerating all these kind of stresses, maybe there needs to be, again, like a step change in the way we view stress. Yes. Particularly, let's say, for women at the age of 40, go, hey, look, maybe I could get away with it 20 to 40, but over the next 10, 20 years, I've got to be careful that I take some time for myself. I take some time to switch off, that I don't take on too much. And I know it's hard because culture is pushing us away from this. And I think that's another big piece of the puzzle here, which we sort of touched on at the start, which is, I think a lot of people have it tough in society, but I think women have got it super tough. Even in this pandemic, Lisa,
yes, we do.
By and large, in my network, right, in the patients I've spoken to, and in my network, and if I'm honest, in my house, women have taken on the bulk of the caregiving duties, the sort of childcare duties. Of course, it's not in every case.
No, for sure.
But I think that would be that I know has been incredibly stressful for many women.
For sure. We we got 6 months of lockdown. I thought it was going to lose my mind. But it's hard regardless of pandemics, I think. And it's really about you being able to deal with stress, because there's always going to be something that is stressful in your life. Right now, everything is pretty much more difficult, but there's always going to be stresses for everyone. And I think it's really important to start looking at strategies to reduce stress and really make it part of our culture, it's not part of our culture. Right? Yeah. Now, in some schools, kids are being taught yoga and meditation, which I think is phenomenal. I wish I had it. Yeah. I learned to meditate by myself. Actually, Dr. Rudy Tanzi taught me into that as soon as I moved to New York, and that really changed my life. I thought he was like excuse me, aren't you a scientist?
So were you skeptical? This is interesting. So as a scientist, you were skeptical.
Oh my God, of course. Yeah, for sure. Yoga. I love both, and they have an incredible beneficial impact on the health of my brain, for sure. But also now we have actual clinical studies showing that they really change the functionality of your brain if you do it consistently enough and according to specific traditions or specific practices. And one practice that I describe in the book is the Kirtan Kriya, which is a form of Kundalini yoga, but is actually a meditation that's been scientifically proven in clinical trials to improve blood flow to the brain, reduce cortisol levels, and improve memory function, specifically in women during midlife and after. And it's an 11 minutes meditation that is you probably are familiar with it.
I had some Kundalini yoga classes last year with my wife. Actually, we had this instructor would come Every Friday evening, we do that for a while. And,
good.
I do that meditation as well. It's so fascinating for me to hear the skeptical scientist.
I was so skeptical.
Is now rocking out Kundalini yoga. It's brilliant.
Yeah, I'm more into running. I'm more of a runner. But yes, I think it's fantastic. And I think there are tools that may not work for everyone. But I think there are so many different options and so many different forms. It's like exercise.
Yeah.
There's something that will work for you. It's just a matter of finding out what you enjoy, what you can do consistently over time. Because if you do it for 3 days, it's not the same as really having a regular practice. And I think a lot of people have a hard time putting in the effort with regularity.
Yeah.
But the beauty about this meditation is that it's literally only 11 minutes, 12 minutes.
And there's loads on YouTube. If people want to follow it, you can just look it up on YouTube and follow one along if people want to try it. I mean, Lisa, look, we've not even got into your 8 pillars yet, and I have about 10 minutes left. So I know my audience are going to love this, Lisa. We'll see what we can get through, and I might be able to persuade you for a part 2 at some point, because I really think people will enjoy this. But the things I thought, we'll get through more if we can, but I found the stuff on phytoestrogens and soy really interesting. And I don't think people on my show have heard much about that before. So I wonder if you could expand a little bit on those.
Yes. So we were talking about hormonal replacement therapy, and which makes total sense, right? So as a woman, you're losing some of your estrogens, and the idea is to replace them with estrogens that come from the outside. Now, the source of the estrogen is something that a lot of scientists are looking into, because where are these hormones coming from, right? In the very early formulations of estrogen replacement therapy, and still in some formulations today, the hormones were coming from the urine of pregnant horses, which is not attractive perhaps in some ways, but it's a very reasonable source. They have to come from something, right? So they can come from animals, or they can come from plants. And something that I find very beautiful is that estrogen or estradiol is arguably the most ancient of hormones, which means that it's shared across all living beings, plants, animals, humans, as we also are animals, but we tend to forget about. So what that means is that plants make estrogens. They're called phytoestrogens from Greek, estrogens from plants. And they are so bioactive and so easy to share across species that the estrogens made by a flower or a plant really works the same way as the estrogens made in our own body. They're just milder. The effects are milder. They're more gentle. So sometimes people wonder, and some people are looking into this right now, myself included, if a diet that includes a lot of phytoestrogens from safe sources could be a gentle replacement to hormonal therapy. And the answers from culture broadly seems to be probably yes. So where are these phytoestrogens coming from? The most abundant source is soy. And soy is very controversial. Yeah. But like we were talking about before, women in Asia do not suffer the kind of hot flashes and night sweats and neurological symptoms of menopause the same way that women do here in industrialized countries. It is possible that there's a genetic component. It is possible that the high quantity of isoflavones from the soy in their diet could also make a difference. Isoflavones are a very strong source of phytoestrogens.
Yeah.
Now, soy here is different. It's polluted. It's GMO, genetically modified. Is more of an allergenic for us than for Asian populations. So that may not be the best way to think about phytoestrogens. But there are a ton of other foods that contain a different kind of phytoestrogens. They're called lignans. And those foods are perfectly safe. And they're found very often in the Mediterranean regions. And we know that women on a Mediterranean diet have a much lower risk of heart disease, heart attacks, strokes, depression, anxiety, breast cancer, and dementia when women are on like a Western type diet. So there's something about this diet that seems to be quite protective and quite supportive of women's health. And the key nutrients are sesame seeds, great source of phytoestrogens, flax seeds, also a great source, dried apricots, believe it or not, for some reason, all sorts of legumes, especially chickpeas and beans, some fruits, especially strawberries, melon, cantaloupe. All these fruits and vegetables are really rich in phytoestrogens, and I have a whole list, of course I'm a scientist, so I have a whole table in the book with all different sources by group and their bioactivity. So I think for me personally, that's the way I eat. And I've done so much research using brain scans where we show quite clearly that if you're like a 50-year-old woman, your brain looks at least 5 years younger if you're on a Mediterranean diet. I'm going to say this again. If you're a 50-year-old woman on a Mediterranean diet, your brain looks at least 5 years younger as compared to a woman who's also 50 years old, but who's been on a Western diet for most of her life. I mean, you can see them. You can see the brain scans. You can see the way the brain doesn't change when you follow a Mediterranean style diet, and the way your brain literally shrinks at age 50 when you are on a Western style diet.
And do we know, obviously you mentioned one component, some of those foods there are obviously very prevalent in Mediterranean style diets. The term Mediterranean style diet gets misinterpreted quite a lot, and lots of people use it to make the case for different kinds of foods. And so I wonder, and I appreciate you've written a whole book, Brain Food, on different foods for your brain, which is well worth reading, and so lots of practical advice in that and lots of specific foods. But, you know, is there some general broad principles of what you're talking about when you say the Mediterranean diet?
Yes. And I think, again, it's important to say Mediterranean style diet, because otherwise it becomes really impractical. Even for me, I can't find the same foods here that I used to eat in Italy growing up. But the point is plant-centric. So vegetables and fruit and grains and legumes are really the focus of the diet. When we use condiments, they're more like unrefined vegetable oils, like extra virgin olive oil, flax oil. Flax oil is incredible for vegans. I know there are so many vegans in England, and a lot of your followers are vegan as well. I'm on and off vegan forever. Flax oil is the oil with the highest concentration of polyunsaturated fatty acids, even more than extra virgin olive oil. And one concern about veganism is that unless you take supplements, your omega-3s could be quite low, because especially the kind of omega-3s that are so important for brain health, so the DHA, because plants contain AHA that the brain needs to convert into DHA, and up to 70% is lost in the conversion. So just 1 tablespoon of flax oil is pretty much more than half of all the omega-3s that you need for the day. Wow. So just a tip, because I was very excited when I found out. I did a lot of research on that.
But that's a great practical tip for people. Yes. Super great practical. That's something people can do right now. If they, after this podcast, they can actually order something and actually start bringing it into their diet every day, right?
Yes, it's very yellow. It tastes really nice. It's great with salads. So why not?
Fantastic.
It's a good tip. Yeah. Also, fish is a big part of the Mediterranean diet, whereas meat and dairy products are considered more like a treat, like an occasional treat. It's a very flexible diet. It's a very reasonable diet. It's not, is not in any way suggesting deprivation or food restriction, which I find very sensible as a scientist. We always talk about diversity in the diet as being real key to health.
If you enjoyed watching that clip, here's another powerful clip that I think you will also really enjoy.
The whole idea of reducing sugar by just adding unlimited amounts of these chemicals has to be thought through, and we should be weaning people off ultra-sweetened products, which make them more likely, particularly kids, to seek sugar.